The torches came up the ridge like a line of falling stars, and Calvin Prescott stood at the front of that line with his own unlit in his fist. Prescott. Sergeant Dallow's voice cracked across the frost like a whip. Light it. That is a direct order from Captain Voss, and Captain Voss speaks for the march. Light the torch. Below them, in the shallow bowl of the valley, Stonefang Hollow slept under a thin coat of snow. Hide tents and low timber lodges huddled around banked fires. A dog barked somewhere, then went quiet. Calvin could see the shape of a woman carrying water, the shape of children's boot prints crossing between two doorways, the shape of an entire village that did not know 20 armed men stood on the ridge above it with fire in their hands and murder in their orders. They raided the Hollies' farmstead, Dallow said, softer now, as if gentleness might work where command had not. 3 dead. Voss wants an example made so the clans remember what raiding costs. They didn't raid anything, Calvin said. His voice did not shake, though his hands did. The Hollies boys blamed orcs because it was easier than admitting they lost their own herd to wolves. I saw the tracks myself. Wolf tracks, Sergeant, not orc boots. That is not your call to make. Then whose is it? A man who's never set foot past the tree line. Around them the other soldiers shifted, torches hissing, sap popping in the cold. Somewhere a horse snorted and stamped. Calvin looked down at the unlit torch in his own hand, the pitch-soaked head black and waiting, and he thought of his mother's kitchen burning to a foundation of ash when he was 9 years old. A house fire that had nothing to do with orcs or war, just a spark and dry timber and bad luck, and how there had been nothing in the world so final as watching something you loved become smoke. "I won't do it," he said. Voss rode up through the ranks then, cloak snapping, face carved from the same cold as the ground. "Refuse a lawful order in the field, Prescott, and I will have you hanged before we have this village hanged. Then hang me." Calvin planted the torch head down in the snow, where it hissed once and went dark for good. "But I will not be the man who lit the fire that killed people for wolves' work." It should have ended there with him in chains and the village burning anyway, and it very nearly did. The torches went forward without him. He heard the first scream a heartbeat before he saw the first flame catch a lodge roof. And after that the night became a smear of orange light and running shapes and voices in a tongue he did not speak, all of it rising up the ridge like heat off a forge. He broke from the line then, unarmed but for a belt knife, and ran down into that chaos not to fight but to pull 2 children out from beneath a collapsing timber frame, to shove an old orc man bodily out of a doorway before the lintel came down, to do what small, useless, human things he could while the world burned around him. He did not know in that smoke and screaming that a young orc woman with blood on her brow from a falling beam had watched him from the tree line beyond the last row of tents, watched a soldier's torch lie dark and cold in the snow, while every other torch in that column turned her home to ash, and had marked his face into memory the way a blade marks a whetstone, for good. Her name was Ragesh Bloodhorn, and she was 19 years old, and she did not forget him. They broke Calvin for it, of course. Insubordination in the field, conduct unbecoming, a dozen charges dressed up in official language that all meant the same thing. You did not do as you were told. They did not hang him. Voss wanted to. But cooler men above Voss decided a public execution of a soldier who had, after all, saved children from a fire other soldiers set, would raise questions nobody in command wanted asked. So instead they stripped him of rank and sent him to the one posting nobody else wanted, bridge warden of Ashford Crossing, the lonely timber and stone span over the Greywater River, where the kingdom of Aldenmark's northern frontier met the free clanholds beyond Frostfang Pass. A punishment posting, a place where a man could freeze quietly and be forgotten. He had been there 8 years now. The bridge house was a low stone building with a single chimney, built into the near end of the span itself, with a tall window facing the road and a narrow door facing the water. Calvin kept it clean because there was little else to do with his hands in the long dark months. He kept a ledger of tolls, though few enough travelers crossed in winter to fill a page a season. He kept a fire, and a kettle, and a cot, and on the wall above the mantel, wrapped in oiled cloth and never spoken of to the handful of merchants and soldiers who passed through. He kept a burnt torch handle with a blackened, unlit head, the last physical thing in the world that proved he had once refused an order and meant it. It was midwinter, the sun barely climbing above the tree line before sliding back down into an early dusk, when he heard hooves and boots on the frozen planks of his bridge, more of them than any merchant train he'd tolled in a year, and stepped out into the cold with his ledger in hand, and no idea that the woman who had watched his torch die in the snow 8 years ago was about to ride onto his bridge with blood on her leathers and death behind her. There were 9 of them, orc warriors on shaggy northern horses, breath steaming from both riders and mounts alike in the blue evening light, and at their head rode a woman who made Calvin's ledger nearly slip from his fingers. She sat her horse like she had been carved into the saddle, tall even for her kind, shoulders squared beneath a fur-lined cloak thrown back despite the cold, and beneath that cloak she wore fitted leathers the color of old rust, a bodice laced tight up her front with bronze clasps shaped like claws, sleeves cut close to strong forearms, leggings that hugged powerful thighs down into fur-topped boots. Twin hand axes rode at her hips, their handles worn smooth by years of grip. Her tusks were small and neat, more elegant than fearsome, and her skin held the deep green-gray of stone under moss. A long black braid, threaded through with small bones and a single bronze bead, fell over one shoulder. Her eyes found him immediately, amber and sharp, and did not look away. "Tolls a copper mark a horse," Calvin said, because it was true, and because he did not trust his voice to say anything else yet. "We are not here to pay a toll, bridge warden." Her voice was low and rough, and it carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has ridden a long way while afraid. Behind her, 2 of the warriors slumped in their saddles, one with a crude bandage darkening at the shoulder. "We are here because this is the only crossing for 40 miles that is not watched by Varric Ashgrave's men, and because we are being hunted, and because I have decided you will help us. You've decided a lot for a woman who's never met me. I have met you." She swung down from her horse in one fluid motion, boots crunching in the snow, and closed the distance between them until she stood close enough that he had to look up to meet her eyes. 8 years ago, Stonefang Hollow. You were the soldier whose torch never lit. The ledger did slip from his fingers then, thudding into the snow between them. "You were there," he said. "I was 19. I watched from the tree line while my home burned, and I watched you, the only one of them, plant your torch in the snow and let it go dark rather than burn my people's homes. I have thought of that unlit torch more times than I can count, Bridge Warden. I did not know your name until 3 days ago, when a man in Alder's Ford told me the story of a disgraced soldier sent to freeze at Ashford Crossing for refusing an order to burn an orc village. There are not 2 such stories in the whole of the march. There is only one, and it belongs to you." Calvin bent slowly and picked his ledger back up out of the snow, mostly to give his hands something to do that was not shaking. "My name's Calvin Prescott," he said, "and I'd like to know why a war band of 9 is running from Lord Varric Ashgrave's men with a wounded warrior, and no more than an afternoon's lead, if that's what I'm looking at." "Because Varric Ashgrave murdered my father," Ragesh said, "and forged a writ claiming the old treaty lord named him warden of the whole North March before he died, and now he means to erase every clan chieftain's bloodline that could stand against that claim, starting with mine. We are what is left of Stonefang's people, Bridge Warden. We rebuilt once further north, after your kind burned us the first time. 3 nights ago Varric's riders burned us again." The words landed in Calvin's chest like a physical blow. He looked past her at the tired, wounded riders, at the wary way they watched him, a human in a King's-issue coat, holding a King's-issue ledger, standing at a King's crossing, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after 8 years of quiet penance, exactly what was being asked of him and exactly what he was going to do about it. "Get your wounded inside," he he said. "There's a fire and a kettle and floor space enough for 9 if you don't mind sleeping close. We'll talk about Varric Ashgrave once your man's shoulder is looked at." Ragesh studied him a long moment, amber eyes narrowed, as if she had expected an argument and did not quite know what to do with its absence. "You would let armed orcs into your home on my word alone." "I let a torch go dark on less than that," Calvin said, and turned to open the bridge house door. Inside, by firelight, the wounded warrior, a broad young orc named Ket, who could not have been older than 20, gritted his teeth while Calvin cut away a crude bandage and cleaned a spear graze along his shoulder with boiled water, and the last of a jar of pine tar, salve his mother had taught him to make before she died. Ragesh crouched close, not out of distrust exactly, though there was still plenty of that in her folded arms, but because she would not have anyone tend her people without watching how it was done. The other warriors ringed the small room, filling it with the smell of horse and leather and cold iron, and Calvin worked with the calm, unhurried hands of a man who had learned battlefield stitching a long time ago and never quite forgotten it, even after 8 years of tolling coppers instead of counting wounds. "You know field medicine," Ragesh said. "It was not quite a question. I know it better than I know most things." He tied off the last stitch and sat back on his heels. "There. He'll ache like sin for a week, but the shoulder will hold. Why does a bridge warden carry a soldier's needle and thread?" "Because I was a soldier before I was a bridge warden," he said, "and because old habits don't die just because a man's been demoted." He wiped his hands on a cloth and finally allowed himself to really look at her, the strong line of her jaw, the fierce set of her mouth, the way even exhausted and hunted she carried herself like a woman who had never once considered kneeling to anyone. "Tell me about Varric Ashgrave. All of it. If he's forging writs and murdering treaty lords this far north, that's not just your problem anymore, Ragesh Bloodhorn. That's mine too." She told him over the fire, while her warriors ate the last of his winter stores and did not apologize for it, and he did not ask them to. Varric Ashgrave had been a minor lord of no particular note until the old warden of the North March, Lord Alaric Thorne, the man who had signed the treaty that kept a fragile peace between Aldenmark's border towns and the free clanholds for a generation, had died of a sudden fever that everyone now quietly suspected had been poison. Varric had produced a writ, apparently signed by Thorne on his deathbed, naming Varric his successor as warden. The king's court, far to the south and slow to act on frontier matters, had not yet ruled the writ false, and in the meantime Varric was moving swiftly to make his claim impossible to reverse. Hunting down the orc chieftains whose bloodlines had co-signed the original treaty, because a treaty without living signatories on both sides was, by old law, void, and a void treaty meant Varric could seize clan land outright as unclaimed frontier and call it conquest instead of theft. "My father died defending our new village," Ragesh said, staring into the fire, her jaw tight. "I have his seal." She drew a leather cord from beneath her bodice, and on it hung a small bronze signet, a stylized boar's head, worn smooth with handling. "And I have this." From inside her cloak she produced a folded, water-stained scroll. "The original treaty. My father kept a copy all these years. If I can reach Vane Keep and put this seal and this scroll in front of Lord Dorian Ashe, the king's marshal for the whole region, he will have no choice but to declare Varric's writ a forgery and strip him of the wardenship. But Vane Keep is 9 days' hard ride south, through country crawling with Varric's men, and there are only 9 of us left, and one of us can barely sit a horse." Her eyes came up to Calvin's, and for the first time he saw not the fierce warrior but the exhausted woman beneath, carrying the whole weight of her people's future in a folded scroll. "I did not come to this bridge by chance, Calvin Prescott. I came because I remembered a soldier whose torch never lit, and I gambled everything on the hope that the man was as good as the memory." Calvin sat with that for a long moment, the fire popping, snow ticking softly against the shuttered window. Then he stood, crossed to the mantel, and took down the oiled bundle he had kept there for 8 years, unwrapping it with careful hands until the blackened, unlit torch head lay revealed in the firelight. Ragesh went utterly still. "I kept it," Calvin said quietly. "Don't rightly know why, except that some nights it's the only thing that reminds me I did one decent thing in a war that didn't have many decent things in it." He held it out, not quite offering it to her, just letting her see it. "I'll take you to Vane Keep, Ragesh Bloodhorn. Not because I owe you anything, and not because I'm still a soldier who takes orders. I gave that up on a ridge above your village 8 years ago. I'll take you because it's right, and because I think I've been waiting 8 years for a reason like this one to walk onto my bridge." Something moved behind her amber eyes, something that was not quite trust yet, but was no longer entirely wariness either. She reached out one broad, calloused hand and closed it briefly around the blackened torch head beside his own grip, not taking it from him, just touching it, the way one might touch a scar to prove it was real. "Then we leave at first light," she said. "And Bridge Warden, I do not forget debts. Yours is one I mean to repay in full." They left Ashford Crossing at first light with the toll booth shuttered, and a note nailed to the post for any traveler who came looking for a warden who would not return for some time. And the road south unrolled ahead of them, white and dangerous, and utterly unlike anything Calvin had known in 8 quiet years of tolling coppers. The first days were hard riding through open frontier country, the kind of rolling, half-wooded land where a rider could be seen for miles, and a rider could see for miles in turn, which meant both safety and exposure in equal measure. Calvin had never been much of a horseman, a bridge warden had little need of one, and Ragesh noticed within the first hour, watching him grip the reins of the spare gelding they'd brought from the crossing stables with the white-knuckled determination of a man trying not to look foolish. "You ride like a sack of grain," she said, not unkindly, drawing her own mount alongside his. "I ride like a man who spends most of his life standing still on a bridge," he said. "Give me a coin ledger and a toll gate and I'm a marvel. Put me on a horse and apparently I'm a sack of grain." One of the other warriors, a lean, quick-eyed woman named Skarn, laughed outright at that, and even Ket, still favoring his stitched shoulder, cracked a smile. Ragesh's mouth twitched, fighting a grin she clearly did not want to give him for free. "I will make you a wager, Bridge Warden," she said. "A dare, if you like. You stay mounted and upright through the river ford ahead without falling, and I will owe you a boon of your choosing. And if I fall, then you owe me one instead, and I promise you I will not choose kindly." Calvin considered the ford ahead, a wide, shallow stretch of the Greywater's upper tributary, ice crusting the shallows, current visible and quick in the center channel. "Done," he said, and regretted it almost immediately, and made it across anyway with his teeth gritted, and his knees clamped so hard to the gelding's sides that he ached for 2 days after, and did not fall, and Ragesh laughed, a real laugh, rich and startled out of her for the first time since she'd ridden onto his bridge. "Name your boon, then," she said, still grinning as they came up the far bank dripping and half-frozen. Calvin thought about it seriously, water running off his coat, and said, "Teach me to throw one of those handaxes without losing a finger." It was, in its way, the beginning of everything between them, though neither of them called it that at the time. That evening, camped in the lee of a granite outcrop with a small fire shielded from any watching eyes by the rock itself, Ragesh pressed one of her axes into his hand and stood behind him to correct his grip, her fingers closing over his knuckles, her body a warm line of solid heat at his back in the freezing dark. And if either of them noticed how long that correction took, neither said so aloud. He threw the axe 11 times before it stuck true in the fallen log she'd set as a target, and on the 11th throw she let out a short, fierce whoop that startled the horses, and Skarn called out something in the orc tongue that made Ket laugh so hard he had to hold his stitched shoulder. "Your turn to dare something," Calvin said, flushed with the small victory and the closeness of her and the firelight altogether. Ragesh considered him with those sharp amber eyes, head tilted, braid swinging. "I dare you to drink from my flask without making that human face." "What human face?" The one your kind makes when you taste real spirits instead of that watered ale you sell travelers at your toll booth." She handed him a stoppered leather flask, and the liquid inside burned going down like swallowed fire, and he did, in fact, make a face. And she laughed so hard she nearly fell off the fallen log she'd been sitting on. And it was, Calvin thought privately, worth every second of the burn in his throat to hear that sound again. The dares continued as the days rolled south, small at first, a dare to skip a river stone farther than her, a dare for her to try the dried biscuit from his saddlebag without complaint, which she lost spectacularly and loudly, and then, gradually, less small. On the fourth night, huddled close around a fire in the ruins of an old watchtower that offered shelter from a rising wind, Ragesh dared him to tell her one true thing he had never told anyone, and he told her about his mother's kitchen fire, about the house burning down when he was 9, about how he had stood in the yard and watched flame eat the only home he'd ever known and understood, even at 9 years old, that some things once burned could never be unburned. She was quiet a long while after that, and then she said, "Lo, that is why the torch stayed dark," and he realized she had understood something about him that he had never quite put into words even for himself. "Your turn," he said. "One true thing." She stared into the fire for a long moment. "I was supposed to marry a warrior from a neighboring clan when I was 22, she said. "A good match," my father said. "Strong bloodline, strong arm." I broke it off 3 days before the binding ceremony because I looked at him across a fire just like this one and felt nothing at all, and I decided I would rather be alone forever than spend my life beside a man who did not make my blood run hot. She looked up and the firelight caught in her eyes, and something in her voice went quieter and more dangerous than any dare yet. "I have not felt anything close to that since. Until 3 nights ago, watching a bridge warden stitch my wounded warrior's shoulder with a soldier's steady hands." Calvin's mouth went dry. "Ragesh, I am not finished with my dare," she said, and rose smoothly from her seat across the fire, crossing the small space between them with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided the outcome and was only waiting to see if the world would argue with her. "I dare you, Calvin Prescott, not to look away." She did not give him time to answer with words. She cupped his jaw in one strong hand, calloused and warm despite the cold night around them, and kissed him, not tentative, not testing, but hungry and sure, the kind of kiss that asked a question by answering it first. He answered in kind, one hand coming up to the small of her back, drawing her down against him, and for a long moment the wind and the danger and the 9 days of hard road all fell away, and there was only the fire and her mouth, and the fierce, startling fact of being wanted by a woman who could have chosen anyone and had chosen, apparently, him. When they finally broke apart, breathless, her forehead resting against his, she said, "You did not look away." "Didn't want to," he said, and felt her smile against his skin. They did not speak of it again that night, not in words, but something had shifted and settled between them like ice finding its final shape on a river. And the next morning, when Skarn caught Ragesh's eye across the cold camp and grinned knowingly, Ragesh only lifted her chin and dared her lieutenant, quite seriously, to say one word about it and lose a tooth for her trouble. Skarn said nothing further, though her grin did not entirely fade for the rest of that day's ride. The danger did not pause for any of it, though. On the 6th day out from Ashford Crossing, riding through a narrow wooded pass with steep banks on either side, Ket's sharp orc hearing caught the creak of a bowstring a half-second before an arrow hissed out of the trees and buried itself in the snow beside Skarn's horse. "Ashgrave's scouts," Ragesh bellowed, already wheeling her mount, axe in hand. "Down, all of you, into the wash." What followed was a hard, ugly scramble of hooves and shouting and arrows through close trees. 6 of Varric's mounted scouts breaking from cover on both banks, clearly understanding orders to run any orc party to ground on sight. Calvin, no warrior by trade or temperament, found himself dragging his gelding's head around and putting himself, without quite deciding to, between one charging scout and Ragesh's exposed flank, as she traded axe blows with another rider twice her mount's size. He had no sword worth the name, only his belt knife and a length of chain he kept for repairing the bridge's toll gate, but he swung that chain with everything 8 years of bridge labor had put into his arms, catching the scout's spear thrust wide and sending the man tumbling from his saddle into the snow. It was not elegant. It was not the work of a soldier. But it bought Ragesh the half-second she needed to finish her own opponent and wheel to help Ket, and when the skirmish ended as quickly and messily as it had begun, 3 scouts fled, 1 down and captured. 2 more Ragesh's warriors had unhorsed and left disarmed in the snow with a warning rather than a killing blow, because Ragesh Bloodhorn, Calvin was learning, did not kill men who could simply run home and tell their lord they'd lost. She rode straight to him, breathing hard, and grabbed the front of his coat in one fist. "You put yourself between me and a spear with a chain," she said, half furious, half something else entirely. "A chain, Calvin Prescott. It was what I had. You could have died. So could you. I am a warrior of Stonefang. It is my work to nearly die." Her grip on his coat did not loosen. "You are a bridge warden with a coin ledger and a soft human heart, and you nearly died for me anyway." "Guess we're a match pair then," he said, and something in her face cracked open, not with anger, but with a kind of raw, unguarded feeling she seemed almost startled to be showing. And she kissed him again right there in the trampled snow, in front of all 8 of her warriors, fierce and brief and claiming, before shoving him back half a step and barking orders to search the captured scout for any writ or seal that might prove Varric's men were operating this far north on his direct command. Nobody in her band so much as blinked at the kiss. If anything, Ket looked faintly pleased, as if some private wager among the warriors had just been settled in someone's favor. They found, on the captured scout, a signed order bearing Varric Ashgrave's own seal, instructing his men to kill any bearer of a chieftain's signet on sight and burn any proof of prior treaty. It was, Ragesh said grimly, exactly the kind of evidence Lord Dorian Ashe would need to see with his own eyes, and exactly the kind of evidence that made their journey more dangerous with every mile, since it meant Varric's men now had explicit orders to end them rather than merely turn them back. The nights that followed grew colder as they climbed toward the higher country before Vane Keep's Valley, and the dares between them grew warmer in answer, as if some part of both of them understood that danger and desire had learned to run on the same road. She dared him to sleep without his coat one bitter night, wrapped instead in her own fur-lined cloak alongside her for warmth, and he did, and neither of them slept much for entirely different reasons than the cold. He dared her in turn to let him braid a bead into her hair the way he'd seen her warriors do for one another after a battle won, clumsy human fingers fumbling with unfamiliar hair, and she sat very still and let him, and when he finished she reached back and touched the bead, a small carved wooden one he'd whittled himself 2 nights running by firelight with something like wonder. "Among my people," she said quietly, "a woman does not let just anyone put a bead in her hair. It is a mark of choosing, of claiming if the giver is also being claimed in turn. Did I just claim you then without knowing the custom? You did." Her amber eyes held his, steady and unflinching, the firelight dancing across the strong planes of her face. "And I let you, knowing exactly what it meant. So I suppose the only question left, Bridge Warden, is whether you intend to be worth claiming, or whether I will have to throw you back." "I intend," Calvin said, throat tight with something that felt very much like the beginning of the rest of his life, "to spend a good long while proving it." She smiled at that, not the sharp, fierce grin she gave the world, but something softer, kept for him alone. And that night, for the first time, she did not merely sleep close beside him for warmth. She turned into him under the shared cloak, tucked her face against his throat, and murmured against his skin, "I am not an easy woman to love, Calvin Prescott." "Good," he said into her hair. "I was never much good at easy things anyway." 9 days of hard road became 11, then 12, slowed by weather and caution, and on the 12th day they came down out of the high pass into the wide river valley, where the walled market town of Fen Crossing sat astride the southern road like a gatekeeper. And it was there, exhausted, half-frozen and dangerously close to their goal, that everything very nearly fell apart. Fen Crossing was garrisoned. That much was clear from a mile out, the town's stone walls flying not the king's banner but a black boar's head standard Ragesh, identified with a curse as Varric Ashgrave's own sigil, and armed men in matching black and gray livery patrolling the market square visible even from the road above. They should have gone around. Ragesh argued for it fiercely, wanting to skirt the walls entirely and find another way south. But Skarn's mount had gone lame on the descent, Ket's shoulder had reopened with the cold and hard riding, and their supplies had run thin enough that another 2 days of open wilderness travel without resupply risked losing warriors to exposure rather than to Varric's blades. Calvin, with his weathered king's-issue coat and his passable if rusty command of proper frontier speech, argued that he alone could pass into the town as an ordinary traveling toll officer, buy supplies and news, and be gone again before anyone looked twice, while Ragesh and her band waited hidden in the tree line beyond the walls. It should have worked. It very nearly did, right up until a black-liveried guard at the market stalls recognized the description of a warband riding with a wounded warrior and a captured scout's tale of an orc woman carrying a bronze boar's head signet, and put 2 men on Calvin's tail the moment he left the grain merchant's stall, and 3 more on the tree line within the hour, and by the time the sun set on Fen Crossing. Ragesh Bloodhorn stood chained at the wrists in the center of the market square with the whole town gathered in a ring of torchlight around her, and Lord Varric Ashgrave's garrison commander, a broad-shouldered knight named Sir Holt Draven, stood on the raised judgment platform reading out a proclamation to a crowd that did not yet know whether to be afraid or thrilled by the spectacle unfolding before them. By the authority of Lord Varric Ashgrave, rightful warden of the North March, Sir Holt read, voice pitched to carry across the square, this orc woman, bearing a forged chieftain seal and traveling under arms in defiance of the march's peace, is declared enemy of the crown's frontier and forfeit of freedom. As is custom under frontier law for enemy prisoners of value, she shall this night be put to trial by combat, or else sold at open auction to whichever bidder the garrison deems fit to hold her slave collar or blade, her choice which. The crowd murmured, a low, ugly hum of curiosity and old prejudice stirred awake by torchlight and spectacle. Somewhere in that crowd Calvin stood pressed against the back wall of a cloth merchant's stall, heart slamming, watching chains catch torchlight on Ragesh's wrists, watching her stand utterly straight-backed and defiant despite them, chin lifted, amber eyes scanning the crowd, and finding him for one bare instant across all that torchlit distance, a look passing between them that said as clearly as words, "Do not be a fool for my sake," and Calvin thought with a strange, clear calm settling over the roar of his own pulse, that he had never in 8 years been quite so certain of anything as he was about to be a fool for her sake gladly, and would do it again 100 times over. He walked out into the torchlight before he had fully decided to, boots ringing on the packed square stones, and the crowd's murmur spiked and then hushed as they took in the sight of an ordinary-looking man in a worn king's-issue coat pushing through to stand directly beneath the judgment platform. "I invoke the warden's right of challenge," Calvin called up, and his voice, to his own faint surprise, did not shake at all. Under Old March law, any officer holding a crown-appointed crossing may challenge for the disposition of a prisoner taken within a day's ride of that crossing's jurisdiction, in place of auction, by right of combat or by right of law. I am Calvin Prescott, Bridge Warden of Ashford Crossing, appointed by the Crown itself, and I challenge for this woman's freedom. The square erupted into noise, shouted disbelief, someone laughing, someone else calling for silence, and up on the platform Sir Holt Draven's broad face split into a slow, contemptuous grin. "A bridge warden," he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, challenging for an orc's freedom against the garrison commander of Fen Crossing. He drew his sword, a heavy, well-used blade that caught torchlight along its edge, and turned it once in his grip almost lazily. Old law does grant the challenge, little toll keeper. It also grants me the right to answer it myself in Lord Ashgrave's name. I hope you have made your peace with whatever god you pray to. I haven't prayed in years, Calvin said, stepping up onto the cleared stone at the platform's edge as guards shoved back the crowd to make a ring of space, but I imagine I'll manage. Ragesh's voice cut across the square then, sharp with fury and fear both. Calvin, no, he is a trained knight, he will kill you. Then I suppose I'd better not let him, Calvin said, not looking away from Sir Holt, and drew the only weapon he had ever truly mastered in 8 quiet years at a lonely bridge. Not a sword, but the long iron toll chain he still wore looped at his belt from the road, the same chain that had turned aside a scout's spear a week before, weighted at one end with the heavy brass tollbox key that never left him. The crowd laughed at that too, at first, a bridge warden with a chain against a knight's sword, but the laughter died fast once the fight actually began, because Calvin Prescott had spent 8 years alone at a crossing with nothing to do in his idle hours but swing that chain at fence posts and river stones and, twice, real armed men on that long road south, and Sir Holt Draven, for all his size and his fine blade, had spent those same years growing fat on garrison comfort, and had not truly fought a desperate man in a long while. The knight came in hard and fast, expecting the fight to end in the first exchange, and Calvin let the chain's weighted end catch the flat of the descending blade and turn it wide, stepping into the knight's guard rather than away from it, the way instinct screamed to, close enough to smell wine on the man's breath, and drove the heel of his hand up under Sir Holt's jaw with everything 8 years of hauling toll-gate timber had put into his arm. The knight staggered. The crowd gasped as one. Sir Holt recovered fast, swinging wide in fury now rather than confidence, and the blade caught Calvin's shoulder in a shallow, burning line that tore through coat and skin alike and dropped him to one knee with a grunt of pain. And for one terrible, suspended moment, the whole square held its breath, and Ragesh strained hard enough against her chains that the guards holding her had to fight to keep their grip, screaming his name across the torchlit stone. But Calvin had grown up watching his mother's kitchen burn and learned, at 9 years old, that some things you do not get to undo, and he had decided on a frozen ridge 8 years ago that he would rather die refusing than live having obeyed, and he was not about to change that now for a cut shoulder. He came up off his knee, inside the reach of Sir Holt's next overextended swing, chain looping fast around the descending sword arm, and hauled with all his weight, and the heavy tollbox key on the chain's end cracked across the back of the knight's skull with a sound the whole square heard, and Sir Holt Draven went down onto the market stones and did not get back up. Silence held the square for 3 full heartbeats. Then it broke apart into a roar, some of it fear, some of it something that might, in a town long resentful of Varick's black-liveried garrison sitting heavy on their market and their tolls, have been quiet satisfaction. And Calvin, breathing hard, blood soaking warm down his cut shoulder, turned to the platform guards and said, in a voice that carried and did not waver despite the pain, "Old law grants the winner the disposition of the prisoner. I claim her, strike the chains." For one long moment no guard moved, uncertain whose authority to fear more in that instant, and then an older man in the crowd, a merchant, by his dress, who had clearly had his own dealings with Varick's tax collectors and no love left for them, called out, "The law's the law even under a false warden's men. Strike them." And the crowd took up the cry, and whatever authority Sir Holt's unconscious body had lent the garrison evaporated into the cold night air, and a guard, more out of fear of the crowd now than loyalty to a fallen commander, stepped forward and struck the chains from Ragesh Bloodhorn's wrists with 2 clean blows of his own dagger hilt against the lock. She crossed the square to him before the chains had even finished falling, ignoring the crowd entirely, and caught his face in both hands, checking the cut at his shoulder with quick, urgent fingers, cursing softly in her own tongue, and then in the common speech both at once. "You absolute fool," she said, voice cracking. "You utter, reckless, wonderful fool." "Told you I'd manage," Calvin said, swaying slightly, and let her catch him as his knees finally gave out from the blood loss and the sheer spent adrenaline of it all. They did not linger in Fen Crossing. Scarn and the others, alerted by the commotion and slipping in through the confusion of the crowd, got Calvin onto a cart borrowed. Not quite legally, though nobody in that town seemed inclined to stop them, from the same merchant who'd called for the chains to be struck. And by midnight they were beyond the walls and moving south again under cover of dark, Ragesh riding close beside the cart with one hand never far from Calvin's, watching the wound she'd cleaned and stitched herself with hands that would not quite stop shaking despite her own fierce competence. "You are never doing that again," she told him somewhere in the small hours when the fever of the fight had finally cooled enough for real conversation. "I forbid it. You forbid me from defending you. I forbid you from nearly dying for it while I stand in chains and watch." Her voice broke on the last word just slightly, more revealing than she likely intended. "I have lost my father, Calvin. I have lost my home twice over. I did not ride 9 days south and drag you into this war to lose you too." "You didn't drag me anywhere," he said, reaching up despite the ache in his shoulder to catch her hand where it rested against the cart's edge. "I walked into that square on my own 2 feet, Ragesh, because the thought of watching you sold at auction or forced into a duel you couldn't fairly win in chains was worse to me than any sword. I'd do it again tomorrow if it came to it." "Then I will simply have to make certain it never comes to it again," she said fiercely, and kissed his knuckles once hard before letting go to ride ahead and check the road for danger, though the look she'd given him first told him everything he needed to know about how thoroughly and how completely he had become someone she was not prepared to lose. They reached Vane Keep 2 days later, Calvin's shoulder healing clean thanks to Ragesh's stubborn, careful tending, and were brought before Lord Dorian Ashe, the king's marshal for the region, a lean gray-haired man who listened to Ragesh's account, examined her father's bronze signet and the water-stained treaty scroll and the captured scout's signed order with the same grim, careful attention, and pronounced within the hour that Varric Ashgrave's writ was a forgery, his claim to the wardenship void, and his men's actions against treaty signatory clans a crime against the crown's own peace. Riders were dispatched south and north both, to the king's court and to Varric's holdings, and within the month word came back that Varric Ashgrave had been stripped of every title and holding he'd claimed, and Fen Crossing's black-liveried garrison had scattered or been arrested outright, and the old treaty battered, wrinkled, but never broken stood renewed and honored between the crown and the clanholds beyond Frostfang Pass, with Ragesh Bloodhorn recognized formally as chieftain in her father's place. It should perhaps have ended there, with justice done and the road home open and safe. But Ragesh, standing in the great hall of Vane Keep with her father's signet finally hung properly around her own neck instead of hidden beneath her bodice, turned to Calvin with a look that had nothing to do with treaties or writs at all. "Lord Ashe has offered my clan land grants to rebuild Stonefang a 3rd time, further south where Varric's reach never extended," she said. "It will take time, seasons at least, before it is truly home again. And I find, Bridgewarden, that I am no longer content to simply return to my people and let you ride back alone to your lonely bridge." "Wasn't planning on riding back alone," Calvin said. "Figured I'd ask you first." "Ask me what exactly?" "To come with me. Not forever if you don't want it. Your people need their chieftain. I understand that. But Ashford Crossing sits closer to the new Grant lands than any other crossing on the Greywater. A chieftain and a bridge warden could do a great deal of good keeping that crossing open and fair for both sides, if she were willing." He took a breath, feeling more nervous in that moment than he had facing Sir Holt's sword. "I'm asking you to be more than a woman I helped once, Ragesh. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of whatever years I've got proving I'm worth the bead you let me put in your hair." Ragesh was quiet a long moment, searching his face with those sharp amber eyes gone suddenly, unguardedly soft, and then she reached up and unhooked the bronze bead from her own braid, the one he had whittled and clumsily worked into her hair on a cold night on the road, and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers over it with both her hands. "Among my people," she said, "when a woman gives back the claiming bead into the hand of the one who gave it, it does not mean rejection. It means she asks him to give it again, properly, before witnesses, as a binding rather than a beginning." Her voice roughened. "I am asking you to give it again, Calvin Prescott, properly. Here, before my warriors and whatever king's men care to watch." He did not need to be asked twice. Ket and Skarn and the rest of Ragesh's small, fierce band gathered in the torchlit courtyard of Vane Keep that same night, along with a handful of curious guards, and even Lord Ash himself watching from the steps with something that looked almost like amusement on his lined face. And Calvin worked the small wooden bead back into the black braid at Ragesh's temple, with hands that trembled far more than they had while swinging a chain at a train night. And when it was done, she turned and kissed him in front of all of them, unhurried and certain, and Skarn let out a whoop that echoed off the keep's stone walls and startled every horse in the courtyard. They did not marry that night in the manner of the southern kingdoms, with priests and vows before an altar. That was not Ragesh's custom, and Calvin found he did not need it to feel married in every way that mattered. But that night, in the small guest chamber Lord Ash had granted them within the keep, with the door barred and the fire banked low, and the long, dangerous road behind them finally, truly over, Ragesh Bloodhorn came to him with none of the wariness she'd worn the day she rode onto his bridge and all of the fierce, open want she'd shown him with every dare and every stolen kiss along the way. "I have wanted you," she murmured against his throat, her strong hands working the buttons of his shirt with far more patience than she'd shown breaking chains, "since the fourth night on the road, watching you throw an axe badly and laugh at yourself for it. I have wanted you longer than that, if I am honest. Some small part of me has wanted the soldier whose torch stayed unlit since I was 19 years old and did not yet know his name." "Some small part of me," Calvin said, hands finding the laces of her bodice, unhurried, reverent, "has been waiting 8 years for a reason to feel like more than a punishment posting nobody remembered. I didn't know it would be you. I'm glad every day since that it was." What followed was neither hurried nor tentative. It was the slow, sure unfolding of two people who had already proven, on a frozen road full of wolves and scouts and a knight's sword, exactly how much they trusted one another, and the trust translated easily into tenderness, into low laughter shared against skin, into the particular wonder of a fierce warrior chieftain allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply be held rather than to guard, and of a lonely bridge warden discovering that being chosen by someone who could have chosen anyone felt like nothing he had ever imagined and everything he had, in some hidden corner of himself, always hoped for. The fire burned low and warm in the hearth, and outside the shuttered window the last of the winter stars wheeled slowly overhead, and neither of them thought once, in all that long, warm night, of torches or chains or forged writs, only of each other, finally, fully, and without reservation. They stayed at Vane Keep through the thaw, long enough to see Stonefang's people granted proper title to their new land south of Frostfang Pass, and to see the first timber lodges rise on ground that could not be burned away by any lord's forged decree. And then, true to the promise Calvin had made in that torchlit courtyard, they rode north together back to Ashford, crossing Ragesh Bloodhorn, chieftain of Stonefang, and Calvin Prescott, bridge warden of the crown, side by side on the same stretch of frozen road where, months before, she had ridden onto his bridge a stranger with blood on her leathers, and a debt she meant to repay. A year passed at Ashford, crossing the way years do when a person has finally stopped merely enduring their life and started living it. Calvin still kept the toll ledger, still mended the bridge's timbers each spring when the ice broke, but he no longer did it alone in a cold, quiet house with nothing on the mantel but a wrapped and unspoken memory. Ragesh split her time between the crossing and the new Stonefang lands 2 days' ride south, riding the distance easily on the same shaggy northern horse that had carried her into his life, and travelers on the northern road grew used to a strange and, in time, welcome sight. An orc chieftain and a human bridge warden collecting tolls side by side, settling disputes between clan traders and kingdom merchants with equal patience, sharing a single roof, and by every account any traveler carried south, sharing a bond that neither prejudice nor distance, nor a false lord's ambition had managed to break. The bridge house itself had changed too, in small ways. There were now 2 cots pushed together as one, a second set of axes hung by the door beside Calvin's chain, furs from the Stonefang lands layered over the old King's Issue blankets. And above the mantel, where the wrapped and blackened torch head had hung alone and unspoken of for 8 lonely years, it hung still, but now beside it, mounted with equal care, hung a small carved wooden bead worn smooth by a year of handling, and beneath both of them, on a little shelf Calvin had built with his own hands that spring, sat her father's bronze signet, kept there whenever Ragesh was home at the crossing rather than tending her own new-built lands. Safe and honored in the one place, both their lives had first properly crossed. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Ragesh had ridden onto his bridge with 9 tired warriors and a debt she'd sworn to repay, she found Calvin out on the span itself at dusk, leaning on the rail and watching the gray water run dark and swift beneath the ice-fringed banks, the same spot where he had stood 8 years earlier collecting his first lonely toll as a broken, forgotten man. She came up beside him without a word and slid her arm through his, resting her head briefly against his shoulder in a gesture she would once have considered far too soft for a chieftain of Stonefang to show anyone, let alone a human bridge warden, and yet showed freely now, every day, without a flicker of the old wariness. "You are thinking of that night," she said. It was not a question. "I'm thinking," Calvin said, "that I spent 8 years standing on this exact bridge believing I'd been sent here to be forgotten. And then you rode up out of the dark and told me you'd never forgotten me at all." He turned, catching both her hands in his, calloused palm against calloused palm, human warmth against orc strength, an even match at last after everything the road had asked of them both. "I don't think I've properly thanked you for that, Ragesh Bloodhorn, for remembering, for choosing to gamble your whole future on a rumor about a soldier whose torch never lit." "You do not need to thank me," she said, amber eyes bright in the fading light, fierce and soft all at once, the way only she had ever managed to be with him. "I did not choose you because of one unlit torch on one terrible night, though I will not pretend that memory did not open the door. I chose you, and I keep choosing you, every single day since, because of everything you have been to me on every day that came after, because you put a chain between me and a spear on a road with no reward waiting for you, because you walked into a market square against a trained knight for my freedom with nothing but old law and your own stubborn heart to back you, because you have never once, not for one single moment since I rode onto this bridge, made me feel like I was anything less than exactly what I am." She lifted his hand to her lips, kissed his knuckles the way she had on that dark cart ride south, and held his gaze steady in the dying light. "I have led warriors who feared nothing, Calvin Prescott. I have buried a father and rebuilt a home twice burned to ash. I could have chosen any warrior of any clan to stand beside me as chieftain's consort. I chose a bridge warden with a coin ledger and a soft human heart instead, and I have not regretted it for one single day, and I do not intend to start now." The last light slipped below the tree line, and the first stars came out cold and clear above the gray water, and on the bridge where a torch had once refused to burn, and a debt had once been sworn, and a whole reckless, dangerous, joyful year had unfolded between them since, Calvin Prescott drew Ragesh Bloodhorn into his arms and held her there a long while, both of them finally, fully, unshakably home, not in any single place, but in each other exactly as they had chosen and would go on choosing. For every year the road still had left to give them.